So hello everybody, my name's David Hilson, I'm the Risk Doctor and I'm very pleased to be here to present this session to you in partnership with Sword GRC and to hear a little bit more about the Active Risk Manager product later on as well. I'm going to talk to you today about managing risk in complex mega projects and introduce to you a new way of thinking about risk identification and management which you might not be familiar with. And hopefully that will be useful to you if you manage a mega project or a complex project, but actually also if you manage an ordinary project as well, if there is such a thing as an ordinary project. I guess they're all unique and complex in some way. We're going to be talking for about 40 minutes or thereabouts, and then some Q&A, as Jenny said, at the end. Usually because it sometimes happens that you get a question near the beginning and by the time we get to the end, hopefully that question's already been answered. So we'll keep the questions to the end, but do please feel free to put questions in the Q&A. You'll also find my contact details at the end of the presentation, and I'm very happy to take questions that might occur to you afterwards. So if you're familiar, and I'm just going to do this again, see this happened last time. Click on here and then see if I can, there we go. I was having trouble advancing my slides earlier, solved. So if you're managing complex projects, very often you might get this sense that you've been asked to do a mission impossible. And there are a number of reasons why complex projects are seen as a mission impossible challenge. Project sizes are getting bigger and bigger, measured in lots of different ways in terms of duration or in terms of budget or number of stakeholders or the scope of the requirements. Projects are becoming more complex, and we'll talk about complexity specifically in a moment, but also project velocity is increasing. The pace of change is accelerating. And so we have these large, wicked, volatile projects, which might seem like a mission impossible to those of us who are asked to manage them or to lead them. Mission impossible, of course, is not a random phrase. It comes from the film world. And I'm quite a fan of the Mission Impossible film franchise. I know some people see them as a little bit corny, but they're good fun, and usually things turn out all right in the end. And why is that? What solution have the filmmakers found to make sure that the Mission Impossible for Ethan is not actually impossible in the end? First of all, we have a superstar professional who's involved in the mission and makes heroic efforts to make sure that everything turns out in the end. But he's not on his own. He's supported by an amazing team of highly skilled support artists who each have their own specialist area, who are able to come in and help him out when he can't quite work things out for himself. The film franchise has a massive budget. I think the first 3 films alone had over $500 million budget. Huge budgets, and special effects to die for, or perhaps not to die for, depending on whether you're a good guy or a bad guy. Amazing special effects that just seem eye-watering at the time. And of course, there's always this amazing good luck. Everything turns out all right in the end. You think, you know, what are the chances of that happening, really? But somehow he just seems to make it work. And I think for a lot of us, when we're involved in our complex mega projects, these sorts of characteristics seem to be expected. Maybe you're seen as a complex project manager or a program manager as a superstar professional. You're supposed to do amazing heroic efforts to make your project or program succeed. And of course, you'll have this incredible support team behind you with specialist technical experts who are there to cover your every move, to do all those things that you couldn't do. Massive budget, special effects to die for, and everything is supposed to be really, really lucky. And so, of course, your Mission Impossible complex mega project is bound to succeed, just like as happens every time at the end of the film. Or not. Often that's what people expect, but the reality is something different, isn't it? There is an alternative to this kind of film world solution to complex mega projects, and that is to manage the risk. And what do I mean by manage the risk when we're talking about complex mega projects? It's actually slightly different. The challenge is different from how it is with projects which are not complex mega projects. And I'd like to address that by answering these 3 key questions. First of all, are complex projects different from what we might call ordinary projects? What does that word complex even mean? Complex projects are inherently ambiguous and unpredictable. There's something about them which means that we can't exactly work out how they're going to turn out in the end, because there are things that we do not know that we cannot know. And that's illustrated in these two pictures here, the difference between complex projects and complicated projects. A lot of large projects are complicated, that's true, but not complex. And the difference comes from the root words in the Latin and the Greek, which we don't need to go into just now. But complicated means having many folds. A plexum is a fold. So complicated is something which has many steps to build it, but those steps are well specified and repeatable. So here we have an amazing origami bird made from a single sheet of paper. You can fold it, you can unfold it to get your sheet of paper, and just by following the rules, you could refold it. It's incredibly complicated. There's a lot of steps to go through, and some of them are quite fiddly, but actually it's all defined in advance. If you took apart an aircraft engine, you could take it apart and put all the parts out there and label them all, and then follow the construction plan, put them all back together again, and hopefully it will work. There aren't too many pieces left over. That's complicated. A lot of different moving parts, but they all fit together in the same way every time. Complex is different. So complexity is illustrated by the picture on the other side, the picture on the left, of the bowl of spaghetti or pasta. And the issue here is that there are multiple interactions which appear to be random, which cannot be replicated. If you took a fork of pasta, a fork of spaghetti out of the bowl, and then tried to put it back in again, or you took the spaghetti out and you laid it out on the table and then tried to recreate that same bowl of spaghetti, it's impossible. It could never be done. There is ambiguity and unpredictability in the construction, in the very nature of the bowl of pasta, which isn't there in the multi-folded origami bird. So complexity is different from complication. Complicated means lots of moving parts, but they fit together in a predictable and repeatable way. Complex means lots of moving parts, but they fit together in an unpredictable and ambiguous way that cannot be repeated. So certainly complex projects are different in nature by the types of components and the way they interact together than projects which are just large and complicated. So here's a second question then. Do complex projects, if they're different in nature from other projects, do they have different types of risks? Well, certainly complex projects are subject to ordinary, typical risks, the same risks as every other kind of project, as every other enterprise in life. But there are also emergent risks which come from the complexity, from the fact that there are interactions that we can't foresee, that ambiguity, which means we cannot understand everything about our complex project and how it works and how things fit together. And we can't put things back together in a predictable way. There are risks which emerge as we perform our complex project, which we could not have predicted. And so here is a picture of a black swan, the idea of the black swan being the unpredictable, unknowable risk that we could not know in advance because it sits outside of our frame of reference. And I'm sure you're familiar with the term and the way that it's applied in the risk world. So yes, complex projects have different risks from ordinary projects. They do have the same typical risks that other projects have to do with resources and changes in requirement and stakeholder expectations and all of those other things that we get for every ordinary project. But the nature of complexity means that other types of risk will emerge unforeseen and unknowable until they emerge. Which leads us to the third question: can those risks be managed? Those emergent risks, which are not the same as typical risks that we get on every other type of project. And here's where I'd like to introduce you to a different way of thinking about risk and risk management, which applies and is helpful in the context of complex projects, which perhaps is not so applicable for other projects. And this is called futures thinking. So yes, we can use traditional risk management to deal with typical risks, but how do we deal with emergent risks? I'd like to suggest to you that futures thinking, a way of thinking about risk, gives you a way into handling that kind of emergent risk that is built into ambiguous and unpredictable complex projects. So what do I mean by futures thinking? Futures thinking is a fairly well-established way of thinking, which has a fairly simple stepwise process and a number of techniques which are available to support it. We won't go into a huge amount of detail today, but there's a lot of other information available out there already in books and papers and webinars and so on. So here's the process for futures thinking. It involves thinking about the future in a structured way. And the first thought is, what do I want to happen? What is my preferred future? Or maybe there are a number of options which define alternative preferred futures, and we might be able to rank them in order of the thing that we want to get at the end of our complex mega project. So we define our preferred future as the first step in futures thinking, and this is obviously linked very closely with objective setting, which is something that we should all be familiar with. The second step in futures thinking is to identify not just our preferred future, what we want to happen, but possible futures, what could happen. What are the alternatives out there in that universe of uncertainty and unpredictability that we're working in? What could happen? What are the possible futures? And then within those possible futures, which of those possible futures are probable? How likely is each of those possible futures actually to occur? And within those probable and possible futures, obviously our preferred future is one of those futures. What we want to do is to manage the future in some way to make our preferred future more probable, ideally most probable, so that it's one of the possible futures which is most likely to happen. And that way, by managing the future proactively, we can make sure that our preferred future becomes reality. So that's the process for futures thinking. And there's a number of well-established techniques available to help us identify possible futures. And you'll have heard of some of these: scenario planning, visualization or appreciative inquiry, trend watching and horizon scanning, or a very powerful specific technique called field anomaly relaxation, or FAR. So you can see far into the future. And the idea is that you identify all possible futures, some of which will be unrealistic. So you relax the anomalies, you take them out of the field so that they're not possible. It's a fairly nicely structured way of thinking about the future. So these and other techniques help us to identify possible futures. If you found a lot of words there that started with a P and had future in it and found that a bit confusing, let me just show you in diagrammatic form with an illustration what I just said, but with a picture, because I know some of us think better in pictures than in words. So futures thinking starts with defining my preferred futures. What do I want to happen? And then identifying the full gambit, the full range of possible futures, what might happen out there, what are our options that could occur, and then analysing the possible futures to determine which among the possible ones are most probable, and then managing the future to make sure that our preferred future is one of the probable ones, ideally the most probable one. So that outlines the concept or the structure of futures thinking. And what techniques do we have available to help us to do it? Here's a nice little cartoon. It's a kind of a Flash Gordon cartoon or something like it. It says, even with this future viewing apparatus at my disposal, I find it difficult to envision tomorrow. Curse my puny brain. Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if we had future viewing apparatus that we could just kind of look and see what's coming down the track? Actually, we do. Risk management gives us a forward-looking radar. Risk management scans the future, says what's out there coming in my direction. What things can I spot which might be a long way off in the future, or they might be a little bit closer? How big are they? How small are they? Which way are they traveling? How are they developing? How are they interacting together? Risk management is a forward-looking radar that scans the future and tells us what's coming, gives us early warning of what's heading in our direction. So we can scan ahead with risk management to identify those possible futures using some of those specific techniques that I just mentioned. And then we can use our risk management analytical techniques to look at each of those possible futures and analyze them to find out which ones are most likely. We can look at likelihood and impact and interactions and correlation and dependency and think about alternative scenarios within our risk analysis. And then we can use risk management to manage the future proactively, to change the future before it happens by taking risk-based decisions. So how might that work? Risk management is our forward-looking radar, which identifies our possible futures, analyzes our probable futures, and then allows us to manage the future to make sure that our preferred future becomes most probable. So how could we do that? Let's imagine that we're sitting here at time now on this little diamond. What could happen in the future? As we look ahead of us, scanning with our risk management radar, there's a whole range of possible things that might occur. There are different types of outcome, different qualities of outcome that might occur at different points in the future, depending on how our complex project actually turns out when we pull a forkful of spaghetti out of the bowl. Some of those futures are good. Some of them are very good. Some of them are fantastic. Some of them are bad, and some of them are disastrous. Some of them are unknown and some are unknowable. So we have a whole range of possible futures that could occur based on our actions that we take today and the nature of our complex project. So we scan the future and we see what the range of possible futures might be. But then we don't just sit back and say, okay, this is what could happen. Let's just see what happens. And then we allow the future to kind of happen to us. We're not victims of the future. We have choice, we have agency, we have power in the situation because we can see into the future with our risk management forward-looking radar. So imagine we now move forward from the old position, the old now, into a new now, a position which is a little bit later on than when we first looked, and we do some risk management. Risk management can manage the future so that for each of those potential outcomes that we'd spotted beforehand, we can change them through our risk management actions. So we might take an outcome that looked good and make it better by improving our opportunities, by reducing our threats, by taking some of the options which are available to us. We might kill off some of the bad or the disastrous potential outcomes through risk avoidance, through risk transfer, through changing our scope, through all sorts of different proactive actions to make sure that these bad things can't happen. We might accidentally have to avoid some potentially good options by the actions that we take. We might try and make some of our excellent outcomes more likely, or some of our bad outcomes less bad. So there's a whole range of things we can do through risk management to change the future before it happens, to make some futures impossible, to make other futures more likely or better. But not only through risk management can we change previously identified possible futures, but through the things that we do now proactively, we can introduce new possible futures, things that were not possible until we had taken the actions that we have taken. So we can create new possible futures which are good or very good or excellent, or accidentally maybe create a possible future that's not so good. And of course, we'll always be introducing uncertainty and the unknown through the actions that we take. And so we move forward in time, we change the possible futures that we previously identified, we create a whole range of new possible futures, and then we analyze those. Where are we now? And then we take more risk management action, and we modify the future a little bit further as we move into it. So the idea is that we're not victims of the future, we are victors as we move towards it, taking each step and then looking to see what happened, what's changed, what's coming down the track now, and what can I do to influence that. We have huge power and agency as we manage our complex projects, using the techniques of risk management to visualize and modify the future before it happens. So how do we do that? You remember I said that complex projects have two types of risks. Of course, they are subject to the normal typical risks that any project is subject to, and we have well-established techniques in traditional risk management to deal with those. So our responses include avoidance, transfer, reduction or mitigation, and accepting for bad risks, the uncertainties that if they occur could make it harder for us to achieve our goals, threats we call those. And of course there are upside risks or opportunities, and we have a range of standard response strategies for those. We might call those exploiting or capturing, sharing or positive transfer, enhancing or growing, improving our opportunities, or accepting them with a contingency plan. We all know about this. This is standard risk management. And standard traditional risk management works very well for typical risks that occur on any kind of project, including a complex project. But what about those emergent risks? What about those black swans, those unpredictable, unknowable risks that kind of come out when we start pulling on a piece of spaghetti and everything moves and changes and we can't quite see how? How do we manage the risks that arise in our complex project that were not predicted? For those risks, our standard response strategies don't work, because they depend on seeing and categorizing, qualifying and understanding, describing the risk in advance, and then knowing what to do about it. Emergent risks emerge. That means they appear in front of us, fully formed, too late for us to analyze them and think about them, do something about them in advance. So we need a different approach to manage emergent risk on our complex projects. So how do we deal with those kind of risks? Let's not forget traditional risk management. Of course, it's important for our complex projects, but we need to be doing something different for our emergent risks. Let me suggest to you an approach that I call project continuity management. Now, you will all have heard of business continuity management. And business continuity management is a very powerful standard organizational strategy which makes sure that whatever the future holds, whatever strikes our organization, we can be prepared enough in advance to make sure that it doesn't throw us off track, and we can survive as an organization through applying our predefined business continuity approaches and techniques. And we have a business continuity plan which we practice, all of those things I'm sure you're familiar with. Why don't we apply the same approach in our projects? Why don't we think about having project continuity management? Well, how would we do that? Let me suggest to you that there are two key response strategies which need to form the basis of project continuity management to deal with emergent risk in our complex projects. And the first type of strategy that we can apply is flexibility. Now, flexibility, there's a couple of interesting pictures here. The one which seems to have arms and legs all over the place is one single person. If you count the number of arms and legs, you'll see there's only one body in there, something of a contortionist. Flexibility is the ability to bend without breaking. Or we have a chameleon. Whatever color he's based on, he changes color to adapt to his environment. Flexibility is the ability to adapt easily and quickly to the situation as we find it. And there's a lovely proverb that says the bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists. And in my country here, we've had some storms where we've seen big trees just recently snapping, and poles that carry the telephone wires and the power cables just snapping because they're strong, but when they encounter a power which is stronger than their capacity to resist, they snap. Whereas a flexibility response is saying, well, let's just bend with this, let's go with the flow, let's allow the wind to blow us, but then we can respond back, we can flex back to our previous position when the wind stops blowing. So flexibility, the ability to bend without breaking and adapt to the situation, allows us to deal with emergent risk when it appears. The second key response strategy is resilience. Resilience is the ability to maintain our core purpose and integrity in the face of challenge. Something comes along and hits us, it doesn't throw us and destroy us, we're able to get up and keep going. So the picture on the side there, not a sprinter who collapses, but the marathon runner who just keeps going. One of my personal mottos is COCO, just keep on keeping on. Just put one foot in front of the other, just keep going. Resilience might also be described as the ability to regain our original shape after some pressure deforms our shape. So those little stress balls, those little things that you squeeze as hard as you can, and you let go and they just pop back. How did that happen? That's resilience. We might call it bounce back ability, the ability to bounce back, or maybe even not just bounce back, but maybe bounce forward. Perhaps that might be a better phrase. So resilience in addition to flexibility. Flexibility, we can bend and then come back again. Resilience, whatever comes against us, we can regain our shape while maintaining our purpose. These are two core strategies which form the basis of project continuity management, which enable us to deal with emergent risks that appear that we hadn't foreseen. Things which come out of the bowl of pasta that arose from interactions within our complex project, which we were unable to predict until they occurred. So how do we build flexibility and resilience in our projects? These are the kind of headline strategies, but what sort of things might we do in practice to make sure that our projects can handle emergent risks alongside the traditional risks that we deal with through traditional risk management? Let me suggest a few kind of headline actions that we might take before we move on. Practical project continuity management. This is not just some theory, some idea I thought up in the bath. This is something which works in practice, and I know because I've done it for my organization and helped other organizations to do the same. How do you build flexibility and resilience into your complex project? Actually, into any project, but it works particularly well for complex projects. Let's make some suggestions. First of all, on the project side, How do we make sure in the context of the project structure and the way that we manage the project at the project level that we are flexible and resilient? We can bend, we can adapt, we can bounce back as required. The first thing is to know for sure where we're headed, to have really clear objectives. What is this project for? No matter what comes, you keep your eye on the prize, you see where you're headed, you don't let anything divert your gaze from that. It doesn't matter which way the wind blows, that's where we're going. If you don't have clear objectives, then your project cannot stay on track because you don't know where you're going. Projects need to have an appropriate level of risk budget, management reserve, contingency, whatever you choose to call it, a level of backup in terms of resources, money, people, raw materials, supply chain, all of those things which provide contingency for us. It's important that we have an appropriate level, not too much, which is wasteful, not too little, which isn't enough, but we set a risk budget and a management reserve and levels of contingency which are appropriate to the potential disruption that we might face. And setting risk budget and contingency levels is not a trivial task. It's something which requires quite a deal of thought and analysis. At the project level, we need to have flexible processes that can bend and can flex with the changing circumstances. If something comes up on our project, which we hadn't foreseen, and the process says you have to go through these 3 steps and get 5 signatures before you can move on, well, that's going to restrict us and stop us being flexible enough to adapt to the situation that's in front of us. We need flexible processes, not cutting corners, not compromising on quality or on performance, but making sure that the process itself doesn't hold us down. And of course, change management. Change management is key to having flexibility and resilience. The ability to understand the likelihood and the scope of the change, do impact analysis to make sure we make controlled change, unlocking and relocking, all of those standard techniques of change management are really important at the project level to make sure that we have flexibility and resilience to deal with emergent risks. So the way that we structure and manage the project is important, but equally important is the way that we deal with the people aspects. Projects are run by people, not by machines, not by processes or computers. Projects are run by people, and people need to be flexible and resilient as well. It's really important that we don't overlook the people side of our complex projects. We can't just lean on people and expect them to deliver more and more with less and less. We all have a limit, and we need to make sure that we manage our teams sensitively and effectively. So at the personal level, for me as the project or program manager, and for my team, there's a number of characteristics that we need to have in place to build that flexibility and resilience. Effective leadership and risk leadership in particular, the ability to set the rules, to demonstrate the rules, to lead by example, all of those good things in leadership, really important to make sure that the team is coherent and that the team hangs together when things get tough. And then talking of team, an empowered team, a team that has the authority and the resources to act within their limits. They know what their limits are, how far can they go before they have to seek approval or get some kind of some input and sign off. They're empowered to do what needs to be done in order to achieve their part of the project. It's important that I myself as a project leader or project manager and all of my team have good emotional literacy skills. That basically means understanding myself, awareness of what's happening and appreciation of why it's happening, and then having the ability to moderate or modify my internal environment, the way I feel and respond inside when things get tough. I can handle stress because I recognize my blood pressure's going up, my attention span is getting short, my fuse for tolerance of ambiguity and these sort of things, to be aware of those things and be able to moderate myself, to understand what's happening and to do something about it. Emotional literacy is really important in terms of building that resilience in individuals, in people, and a positive attitude, making sure that we understand what we can do, what is within my power, changing the things that we can change and not worrying about the things that we can't, making sure that we have good people around us. We surround ourselves with a supportive team environment. So much that we can do at the team level to make sure that we build that flexibility and resilience into our project, not just in the processes, but in the people too. A few other headings. How about the technical solution? There's a number of things we can do technically to build flexibility and resilience. We can adopt We can adopt an adaptive approach. That was a hard thing to say. We can use iterative development. We can use mixed traditional and agile, waterfall and agile approaches. Lots of different things we can do which create that space to respond to change in our environment. If we're going on some kind of spiral development, we can make sure that as we loop around the spiral, we make space to say, what's changed? Where are we still headed? What do we need to do to stay on track? And building redundancy into our designs and the way that we approach. So it depends obviously on your type of project as to what technical solutions are available, but there are things we can do to create space that gives us flexibility and resilience. And that's true of the contract as well. We can have terms and conditions which allow that adaptability, allow that change. If something changes, here are some options. We can have alternate what do you call it, sort of boilerplate text, which says if we're in this situation, this applies. If we're in this situation, this applies. And then within the contract, a set of clear accountabilities. We're going to do this, you're going to do that, they're going to do that. And everybody agrees and signs up. And then we know where we are when things start to change. What you don't want when things are flexing with emergent risk on a complex project is to have everybody pointing fingers and saying, well, I thought you were going to do that. That's not my job. Who's doing that anyway? Clear accountability is really important. And then finally, at the level above the project or the program, at the business and organizational level, it's really important that we have a culture which also encourages flexibility and resilience. We have a resilient organization. And that comes from knowing who we are as an organization, a shared corporate culture, understanding how we operate, what's important to us, what our values are. These things become anchors when things are changing all around us. The culture and the values of the organization will help us to make sure that our project stays on track because we understand who we are, what we should be doing and shouldn't be doing, what is a red line that we can't cross ethically. These sort of things help us to make sure our project stays on track. And all the techniques of stakeholder engagement become relevant here so that we can make sure we communicate clearly, our stakeholders understand what's going on and how it affects them and how they can influence things and help us. So there's a whole set of things we can do, and each of these are headlines, and obviously there are techniques and more detail that we could talk about underneath each of these levels. But it gives you the idea that there's a massive approach here, not just traditional risk management with avoidance and transfer and mitigation and so on, but all of these things to do with how we operate our project, who we are, how we fit things together so that when things change, as they surely will, we're ready to do something that keeps us on track. If you wanted one word to describe project continuity management, it might be this word, agility. And I don't mean here agile project management, although that could be part of the solution. I mean the ability to move quickly and freely, the ability to stay balanced, the ability to keep moving when things are changing around you and underneath you. And what we want is agile projects and agile organizations run by agile people so that we can be flexible and resilient in the face of emergent change. So hopefully that's given you some thoughts. I've used this slide for quite a long time to illustrate flexibility and resilience. If we can't control the tides, we can at least learn to build better boats. And I've used it for a while. I think it's a great idea. I guess about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was speaking at a conference in India online, and somebody came up with the same idea, but with a much more positive concept that says if we can't control the waves, we can at least learn to surf. And I think that's a much nicer way to think about it. You know, building a big boat just to kind of survive is part of the solution, but surfing the waves, that's much more exciting. I'd rather be surfing than sitting on a boat just hoping to survive. So anyway, hopefully that's given you some idea of how we can build project continuity management into our management of complex projects alongside traditional management, supported by futures thinking to make sure that we understand and manage the risks of our complex projects going forward. So I'm nearly out of time, so let me just give you a few final thoughts before I hand back to Jenny, see if there are any questions that I can address, and on to Matt to talk about the software solution. So here are some final thoughts. Here are 2 pictures, and often people think that projects and project management are like the picture on the left, the railway track, the train track. And people think projects are like this. The track represents our project plan, and it's predefined in advance. It just tells you we've got a starting point and then we've got a destination at the end of the track, and there's a track that goes from here to there. And along the way, we have stations. We stop at this we might call them milestones. So we start here, we stop there, and we get to the end of our chosen destination by following the track. And there's a timetable, and we can say, well, we plan to be at this station at this time, this station at this time. You can get on and off because you know when the train's going to be there. And there's a ticket price. You pay the price, you get on the train, and you go to the destination. Everything is fine, and that's how we think projects are and should be run. Reality is really different, isn't it? Not just on complex projects, of course, on all projects, which is why we need risk management and change management, stakeholder management, communication, all of those other things. Real projects are much more like the picture on the other side. We're on some kind of smallish boat and we're trying to get across a rough piece of water from one side to the other. We can see, we know where the destination is. We could plot it on a map. And if we wanted to, we could draw a straight line from our starting point to our end point across the water. But we all know for sure, as soon as we launch our project, the wind's going to blow and the tide's going to come up and there's going to be people surfing in front of us and small craft, and something's going to go wrong, a rope's going to jam, the sail won't go up. Something will happen and we won't just follow a straight line across the water. We're tacking and we're going backwards and forwards, keeping our eye on the goal, but making sure that whatever situation is, we adjust so that ultimately we end up where we want to go. That's what real projects are like. And so having that kind of plan and timetable and ticket price, all those things are okay to show that the project is feasible. But with real life, we need to be flexible. We need to keep on keeping on and be resilient to whatever the real life throws at us to make sure that we reach our destination in the end. So I would like to suggest to us that managing risk in complex mega projects is possible. It's not a hopeless task. It's not a mission impossible. That futures thinking, understanding what our preferred future, possible futures and probable future are, that helps us so that we can then go ahead to manage the future using risk management. Objective setting defines where we want to end up. Then futures thinking helps us to understand our possible futures. We use risk analysis to work out which of those possible futures are most probable. And then we also use risk management to change the future, to make different things possible so that our preferred future becomes the most probable. Using traditional risk management, of course, for our typical risks, but using project continuity management for our emergent risks, building flexibility and resilience into all levels of our project, including the project processes, but also our people, our contracts, our technical solutions, within a context of the organization which is agile enough to keep going no matter what reality throws at us. So that's pretty much all I want to say. We want to move from mission impossible to mission accomplished. I'd like to suggest the best way to get from mission impossible to mission accomplished is through managing the risk. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to pause at this point and hand back to Jenny. Just before I do, I'm going to flash onto my contact details so that if you have questions outside of this presentation, outside of this session, do please feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to respond separately.